I'm going to read a short section from my first novel, Clay's Quilt, and then I'll read a couple things from my new novel, The Parchment of Leaves. And Clay's Quilt, my publicist says always, show the cover, so everybody say that. Clay's Quilt is about Clay Sizemore, who is 4 years old when his mother is murdered in a shootout, and he witnesses this. And the book concerns Clay trying to come to terms with that. And I'd always loved to read, but in the 7th grade I read To Kill a Mockingbird. And for the whole year after that, I was just so affected by that book that I knew that that's what I wanted to do, was try to affect people that way and to move people and to change their perceptions. And so, yeah, I made a conscious decision after that, you know, that that's what I was going to do, that I wouldn't be happy if I didn't do that. Everybody inspired me to write because they were all always telling stories, and it was just a natural thing to be telling a story. And I wanted to take it a step further and put it down on paper, make it more permanent. And when I was in my very early 20s, the decision became even more conscious because my great uncle passed away, and he was the best storyteller in the family. And so I had a real sense of something being lost. And so it became very evident to me that these stories need to be put down on paper, and new stories need to be put down.
Well, I've just always believed in him. He had a gift. I mean, you know, that's a God-given gift when you can sit down and write something that somebody can see in their head. The very first time that he read to me was way back when he was in high school. I knew that he was going to be a writer. I could just tell you can't just write something like that. He paints pictures and places, and it's just wonderful. He had that gift then. Maybe it wasn't fully developed, but he had it, and I knew, you know, this guy's gonna be somebody someday.
Clay looked out at the snow and wondered if the world had stopped. Maybe it had frozen, grown silver like creek water around the edges of rocks. They had not met one car all the way over the mountain, and the few houses they'd passed looked empty. No tracks on the porches, no movement at the windows. Thin little breaths of black smoke slithered out of chimneys as if the people had left the fires behind. The windows frosted over again, and Aneth took the heel of her gloved hand and wiped off the pasture window so they could look out. The pines lining the road were bent low and pitiful, full of clotted ice and winking snow. Some of the trees had broken in two, their limbs stuck out of the packed snow like jagged bones, with damp yellow ends bright against the whiteness. There was not so much sunshine as daylight, but the snow and ice twinkled anyway. The cliffs had frozen into huge boulders of ice where water had trickled down to make icicles. "Look," Aneth said, "them icicles look like the faces of people we know." She whispered into Clay's ear and pointed out daggers of ice. The one with the big belly looked like his uncle, Gabe. One column of ice looked like a woman with wigged up Pentecostal hair, just like his Aunt Easter.
When Clay's Quilt opens, this is exactly where I was seeing the whole prologue take place. Going over this mountain, which I called Buffalo Mountain in the book, and this is just exactly the way that I imagined it in my mind, and just going over this mountain for about 2 or 3 years as a mail carrier really helped me to capture that place, I hope, in a really vivid way. Everything that's in the prologue is right here. There's the view that they see right before they pull over, and the icicles are hanging off these cliffs in the prologue. Clay's mother points out the icicles to Clay, and this is one of his most vivid memories of his mother that he carries with him. And this place was just really, it was the most peaceful point of my route, my mail route that I went over every day, and the place where I could really think, and I loved this part of my route. Also, just driving through the mountains like this and the cliffs and everything, it's really easy to see why Appalachian riders have a strong sense of place. For me, when I look at this view from up here, when I look at those mountains, it tells me a lot about my heritage, and it tells me about the people I come from, because they had to be tough and rough people to decide to settle these mountains. And so that's what gives me my sense of place. When you look at the view like this, you know who you're from, you know what kind of people you come from, and which is what I always try to do in my writing. And I want to show people what real Appalachia is about, and I think that is what it's about. It's about a strong spirit, and it's a beautiful view up here. And so it was really easy to write that prologue of Clay's Quilt, driving over this every day. And it's my favorite part of the book, the best written part of the book, I think. Probably because I drove over this mountain so many times and had so much time to think while I was driving. It's all here. If they ever shoot a movie, I hope they'll do it right here, because it's exactly the way I try to present it in the prologue.
Well, with Clay's Quilt, it really started because my great uncle had passed away, and I wanted to tell some of his stories. And then when I started doing that, I realized that really what I was really writing about my family and how they had been affected by my uncle's murder. And in the book, it's the main character's mother that's been murdered, but I had to distance myself, fictionalize it enough to actually be able to write about it. And so I was just writing about the way that my father's murder changed the whole family dynamic. And then it came into play that I was writing about my generation, and I'm not sure they had been written about before. I don't know any other books about generationX Appalachians. And so it was a fun thing to write about. It was, that's important to me, that it be enjoyable for me, because I feel like if it's not, then it won't be for the reader. It was a really long process because I was working full time. I had 2 really small children. I lived a life. I think that's something a lot of beginning writers don't do. They hold themselves up in their office, the writing space, for 8 or 10 hours a day, and they try to pound out 5,000 words a day. And that's a big mistake. I think you have to live in order to capture life on the page. And so, I wrote Clay's Quilt over a really long period. And then it was a really long period that it took me to get it published. And I finished the book when I was 23, and it was published when I was 29. So it was a really long process.
Was it cathartic for you to write that book?
It was. I didn't realize it until it was completely finished. And it was even more cathartic, I think, after it was published, because that meant that I had to talk about my uncle's murder. And it also forced the family to talk about it in a way that they hadn't before. Because that was the thing that really struck me, was I was from a family of storytellers, but once my uncle had been killed, they stopped telling stories about him. It was too painful for them to talk about. And so the book allowed us to do that again. So that's where the catharsis really came in.
Clay's Quilt, I may get killed for saying this, and you'll have to edit that, I know, was very autobiographical, whether he really wants to admit to that or not. He grew up writing that book. I grew up with him writing that book. We grew in that with just the writing of that book. It didn't happen. A parchment, he'll say was given to him, and it really was. I can't imagine where he got all of that from. But Clay's Quilt, it's very autobiographical in that we lived a lot of that. You can see Clay grow and mature. Well, that was Silas House growing and maturing, and learning about the world and life. And I think we both grew up a lot with that book.
I've been lonesome, I've been empty. Well, I was raised in a very musical family. My mother was a gospel singer, and I was raised Pentecostal, and that's a very musical childhood when you're raised Pentecostal. I had a a wild aunt who loved rock and roll, and a next door neighbor who insisted that we all listen to classical music. And so I had all different kinds of music coming at me from everywhere. There was bluegrass music at family gatherings, or not really bluegrass, it was more mountain music that people call bluegrass. And I don't know, it's just a natural part of, I didn't know that I was doing anything different when I used a lot of music in my first book, and then it ended up getting a lot of attention because of that. I watched the trees swaying. They moved as if they were underwater, so slow and graceful that you wouldn't even notice unless you stopped to watch. The leaves felt thick and seemed full of juice that might taste good if I broke one open. I touched them lightly, afraid I might harm them, and felt of them the way a blind person might read beads of braille. I wondered if the trees were God. They were like God in many respects. They stood silent, and most people only noticed them when the need arose. Maybe all the secrets to life were written on the surface of leaves, waiting to be translated. If I touched them long enough, I might be given some information that no one else had. Luke and Bertie were like brother and sister, walking in front of us holding hands. Sometimes Luke would let go of her hand and begin to run up the trail, and Bertie would scream out for him to wait. Luke stopped, waited with his back to us until Bertie caught up and took his hand once again. Serena went back to singing, and I reached down to let my fingers brush the tops of ferns that burst up between the rocks. I thank God that my baby could walk and run, that she could holler out with a voice as high and powerful as her father's when he used to come over to Redbud to court me. When we got to the top of the mountain, you would have thought that we would have been give out, but catching sight of the wildflowers took our breath in such a way that we felt the urge to press on. There were so many flowers that we could have never have counted them, and their scent seemed to cover us. It was like a perfume that steamed up out of the mountain.
Let's talk a little bit about your second book, A Parchment of Leaves. How soon after Clay's Quilt did you begin work on A Parchment of Leaves?
Really soon after. I mean, I had already sold, I had already, Parchment already halfway finished before I sold Clay's Quilt, which is why I was able to publish it so quickly after Clay's Quilt. Clay came out in March 2001 and Parchment came out in October 2002, so it's like an 18-month time frame between them. But I didn't want to write A Parchment of Leaves. I wanted to write another contemporary book. I thought that was going to be my thing, was, you know, to capture contemporary Appalachia, contemporary South. But every time I would try to write this new book, I would just keep hearing this woman talking to me and, you know, telling me all these great, I would be informed of all these great scenes, or I would get these great images from this woman's point of view. I really didn't want to write a book from a woman's point of view. It's much too hard to do, because if you fail at that as a man, then you've completely failed with the whole book. And but eventually the voice kind of took over, and I just opened myself up to that voice and let her dictate the story. It was kind of a supernatural experience. I don't know how to describe it.
Like in A Parchment of Leaves, it's wrote in a woman's voice, and that was real hard for him. I had someone ask me once if I went in the bathroom and after he had went in there and the commode seat wasn't up, and I said, no, he didn't really take on female characteristics, but he learned a lot, or at least I hope he did.
My great-grandmother was full-blooded Cherokee, and that's the only thing that I knew about this character that was coming to me, was that she was full-blooded Cherokee. And so I sort of, you know, made it into my great-grandmother's story and let my great-grandmother's life inform this character. And then I started doing research. I went down to the Cherokee reservation for a week and stayed and sort of soaked up what it felt like to be Cherokee in that sense of the land, and tried to live a more simple life. I thought that was important, to go back to what life was like in 1912 when the book starts. And so I raised this huge garden, and I stayed out in the woods a lot, and tried to get into that person's mindset. I became really bogged down in it being a woman's story. And so then I tried to just
look at it as a human being's story, and that enabled me to get it under this woman's skin. And it was a great experience to write the book. I never knew what was going to happen, so it was a lot of fun. I think what makes the best story is when it resonates with the reader, when the reader finds something they can relate to. That was something that surprised me about my first book. Well, I got letters from all over the country and several foreign countries, and people would say, this reminds me of my hometown, or this reminds me of my family. And so I guess, families are more alike throughout the world than we think they are. And especially when you're raised in a rural place, they're very much alike. I always people think of Appalachia as being this very distinct place, but I think it's more about being from a rural place.
And you've kind of answered my next question, because, you're put in that category, Appalachian literature, Appalachian author. But what you're telling me is that's kind of a myth.
Well, I very much identify as an Appalachian, but at the same time, I don't think that it's as pigeonholed as we think it is, because people can relate to it all over the world. Books like Cold Mountain have shown that, and several other books, but that's why I think that Appalachian stories are so popular, is because they involve all those key ingredients that people crave, stories about family and place and fellowship. And so the real moment of kind of realization for me that I had actually accomplished what I wanted was when I walked into a library for the first time and saw the book on the shelf. I had seen it in the bookstore, and that was a great feeling, of course. But the big moment for me was going into the library, because it was there for anybody that wanted it, and they didn't have to have any money. And I had a sense of it, I know it's not completely true, but I had a sense that it could always be there. And also, having been raised in a town where we didn't have a great bookstore, and you either got your books at the flea market or the library, I had a real, devotion to the library. And so that was the big moment for me, that I kind of, lost it.
Having that moment, could you walk away then, never write again, and say, okay, I have achieved?
No. I wish. Maybe if I'd written To Kill a Mockingbird, but that rarely happens. So, no, I still, haven't achieved what I want to. One day I was delivering mail, and had a package from Amazon that I was delivering it, and at this box, this lady always stood out at her box and waited on the mail usually. And it just so happened that I was carrying her mail that day, and pulled up and gave her the Amazon package, and she said, "This is your book, I just ordered it from Amazon." And she ripped it open, and I signed it right there at the mailbox. So. And, lots of those people showed up in my writing in real subtle ways. I learned a lot about human nature by carrying the mail. Someday we'll live.
And Olivia tells, everybody her daddy's a writer. So they're very proud of him, very proud of him. And I think that that helped him know that he'd done something. He accomplished something that was forever going to be left for them. They're going to be able to pick up a book in the library, which they can now, but their kids can. Our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren can pick up a book and know, that so there's a little bit of them in that book.
Do you have a favorite that you've written thus far?
Yeah, I have different kinds of favorites. I think Parchment of Leaves is the best written book. Clay's Quilt is a personal favorite because it's like, it's my first book, and it's kind of like choosing between your children, so I feel guilty when I talk about them. And then my third book, which I've already finished, will be out next year, I think is the most fun, and it's the most accessible. So I like all of them. I'll just, be like a parent. I can't really choose between them.
What do you have yet to accomplish?
Well, every time I finish a book, I think of all the things that I didn't accomplish in it. What I really want to do is just, I want my books to be a tribute to the people that I admire so much, hardworking, dignified people who never sold out, who were never undignified to get what they have. That's the kind of family I had. And so, I think just by writing about them, I want to do them honor.
He never stops writing. It's always, that's just who he is. And like I said, that's a God-given talent. You either are or you aren't. You can't teach somebody to be a writer. And that's Silas House. That's who he is.